As long as it's working, then your stupid perceptions are perfectly fine to get the job done. And that's another indication that what you're using your perceptions for is to get the job done. And how you specify exactly the level of resolution that you should be operating at, I haven't sorted that out, but it's something like you default to the simplest level that moves you to the next step. You know, so for example, and generally that is what you should do. If you're having an argument with someone that you have a long-term relationship with, you can start by arguing about what the little argument is about, or you can immediately cascade into whether or not you should have a relationship with this person at all, or even into whether or not you should even bother with relationships. Which is, you know, every time there's an argument, that question is a reasonable question to have emerge, or at least it's in the realm of potential reasonable questions, but it doesn't seem useful to jump to the most catastrophic possible explanation every time some minor thing goes wrong. That's what happens to people who have an anxiety disorder, and that's what happens to people who are depressed, right? They can't bind the anomaly, and so what happens is it tends to propagate up the entire system until it takes out their highest order conceptualizations. You know, so if you're seriously depressed, maybe you'll watch a news article about something stupid and you'll think, Jesus, why should I even be alive? You know, and I'm dead serious about that. If you score like 60 on the Beck Depression Inventory, which puts you way the hell up in the depressed range, anything that happens to you that's negative will trigger suicidal thoughts, roughly speaking. And sometimes even positive things will do it, because there are very few positive things that happen that don't carry with them some threat of change or transformation. So, you know, one mystery, it's a big mystery, is why don't you fall into a catastrophic depression every time something little goes wrong? Because it's not, that level of analysis is not self-evident. And you see this with people who are high in neuroticism too, you know. Their trivial fluctuations at their workplace or in their relationships or in their health will produce a disproportionate negative emotional response, but it's part of the range of normal emotional responses. Some people are very, very high in neuroticism, so everything upsets them. Some people are very low. And the reason that whole range exists is because sometimes you should get upset when some little thing happens to you, because it's an indication that the whole damn environment has got dangerous on you. And sometimes you should just brush it off because, you know, its net consequence is low. But how do you calculate that? Very, very difficult question. So, you know, when your computer goes wrong, well, you have to pick the proper level of analysis to fix it. And you could say, well, there's something wrong with the circuit board, and maybe, you know, there's a crack in one of the somewhere that it's soldered, and or, you know, sometimes now when people are building microchips, they've run into a crazy problem. You know, microchips keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? And so the little wires now are down to atomic width, or, you know, the width of maybe 20 atoms or something like that, but really, really, they're really getting thin. And so that produces another problem, which no one would have ever, no, you wouldn't expect, and that is, you know, that at the quantum level, there's uncertainty about where electrons might be. Normally that doesn't matter. The degree of uncertainty about where your electrons are is small enough at your size so that it's basically irrelevant. But down at the subatomic level, where these microchips are starting to be produced, sometimes the electrons will be outside the wires, and that means that they're getting so damn small that they'll short circuit by themselves, because the electrons aren't stable enough to be where they're supposed to be in the wires. And so, well, the reason I'm pointing that out is because a problem that exists in a system can exist at any of the multiple levels of that system, and it isn't obvious where to start. And a lot of political arguments are like that, you know. It's like, well, maybe a company goes bankrupt and its shareholders get, or maybe a bank fails, and so people can't withdraw their money. And one response is, well, that just shows you how rotten the capitalist system is. It's like, well, maybe that is what it shows, but it seems like that might not be the most appropriate level to start. And so again, it's like Occam's razor in the scientific world, right? You want to use the simplest explanation that it's not that fits the facts, because you don't organize your perceptions by facts. It's kind of like you want to use the simplest tool you can possibly manage to fix the problem. So you don't, when your car has a flat tire, you don't buy a new car. You fix the flat tire if you can figure out how to do it. And so you go for the thing that will put the tool back together with the minimum involvement of time and effort. It's something like that. And you care about that because you have limited time and you have limited resources. And so it makes sense for you to conserve them. And I'm telling you that partly for practical reasons too, because this is a very useful thing to know. If you're arguing with someone, you want to argue about the smallest possible thing that you could argue about that might fix the problem. You want to really specify it. It's like, what's going on at a micro level, and what's the minimum that I would require to be satisfied with the outcome. And if this is especially true in intimate relationships, is like, if someone's bugging you and you want them to change, you think, well, how can I be minimally bothered by this, and what's the tiniest amount of change I could request that might satisfy me? Because otherwise, the argument will come unglued, and every time you guys try to discuss a problem, you'll start talking about whether you should even be together, and then you're done, because you'll never solve a problem. And then you won't be together, because you'll never solve a problem. So, okay. So, here's a way to think about perception. So, let's say that this is the thing you're trying to look at. I called that the thing in itself. Now, that's a schematic of a thing in itself. So the thing in itself, that's an old philosophical concept, and I think it came from Kant, but I'm not sure about that. It might be older than that. And the thing in itself is what you could see if you could see everything about something, but you can't. So it's a hypothetical entity. And maybe, who knows, if I was looking at you like the thing in itself, maybe I could see every level of your being from the subatomic up to this level of perception, and then beyond. I could see your family relationships. I could see how they were nested in your societal relationships, economic relationships, political relationships, the ecosystem as a whole. Like, I would see all these levels at the same time. Of course, I don't, because I can't. What I see instead is, first of all, you're radically simplified by my senses, because they're just not acute enough to say see you at a microscopic level, and they're not comprehensive enough to see your connections across time. So my senses filter a bunch of you from me right away, and then I'm also filtered from you by your willingness to act like I want while we're together, because you could be doing all sorts of strange things at the moment, but you're not. And so you're helping me simplify my perceptions of you by agreeing to play the same game that I'm playing while we occupy the same space. And that's basically politeness. That's the mark of someone who's well socialized. You walk in somewhere, you get the game, you play the game, and you don't scare the hell out of everybody. And that's partly how we keep our emotions stabilized, because, you know, if you're like a Freudian, you think, well, as long as your ego is well constituted, you can keep your emotions under control. It's like, yes and no, mostly no. I like the Piagetian idea better, which is, if you're well socialized, you're awake enough to identify the game that's going on wherever you go. And then you play that game immediately, and so do all the other socialized primates, and so then you can just understand the game. You don't have to understand them, thank God. You can just understand the game, and as long as the game continues, you don't have to be nervous, because you at least know what's going to happen, and maybe you even know how to get what you want in that game. And so that, again, that's really worth thinking about, because we talked about this before, about why people want to maintain their culture. It isn't just because their culture is a belief system that helps them orient themselves in the world. It's because a belief system is a game that everyone who shares that belief system is playing, and the fact that everybody's playing means nobody needs to get upset. So it isn't like the belief system is directly inhibiting the emotions. That isn't how it works. So, and it's not like the culture is just a belief system. It's only secondarily a belief system, man. Mostly it's a game that people are actively engaging in. That's way more important than the beliefs that go along with it. You don't even need the damn beliefs. You know, that's why wolves can live with each other. They don't know they don't have a belief system exactly. Mostly they have they have a game. It's the wolf game, roughly speaking, and all the wolves know how to play it. And so that's that. That's how they keep themselves organized in their packs. A lot of it's externalized. And so, okay, so anyway, so the thing in itself, that's a very complicated thing. It's got multiple dimensions, multiple levels. And then it's worse than that because it doesn't only have multiple levels, but all of those levels move across time, and every one of those levels shifts as it moves across time. And so I like to think of the thing in itself like a symphony. I think that's a good model. I think that's why we like music, in fact, because music shows you a multi-level reality that unfolds and shifts across time within some parameters, right? Because it's not just chaos. The music has an element of predictability and an element of unpredictability, and it has these multiple levels, and that's sort of what everything in the world is like. It's what the world is like. So this is even that is just a conceptual model of the thing in itself. First of all, that's only got 2 dimensions instead of 3, because it could be a cube. And then it has, even a cube has 3 dimensions instead of 4, because if that was a cube, adding the 3rd dimension, then it would also be a cube that would transform and shift as it moved across time. And that's what the thing in itself is, but that's too damn complicated. So then the question is, when you look at it, what do you see? And the answer is, to some degree, it depends on what you want to use it for. And so I would say, well, here, look at the different ways you can look at this. You might say, what is this? And somebody could say, well, it's a rectangle. And would you say that's correct? It's like, well, it's not correct because there's not a one-to-one correspondence, but it might be a useful conceptualization. If you think about that as a box, it could contain that. And if you were carrying the box, you'd only have to be concerned about the box, and so that would be fine. That's a good functional simplification. That one's a little higher resolution because it says, well, yeah, it's actually 4 rectangles. And that one says, well, wait, think about that as an orchard that someone's looking at from the top. You want to figure out how to walk from south to north. Well, you got a little map there. Because you can think of those as bars instead of collections of dots. Piaget showed that children will automatically do this. So for example, if you take 6 dots and put them in a row, and you take the same 6 dots and you stretch them out so the row is this much longer, and then you ask the child where there are more dots, the child will say that there are more dots where it's longer, because they're flipping in some sense between the perception of the individual dots and the perception of the shape that the array of dots makes. And so the shape is longer because you can see it as a rectangle, and so they think, well, longer is bigger, bigger is more, there's got to be more dots. So, well, then there's this one, which is sort of an amalgam of this one, and then that one. There's that one, and that's the highest resolution model of that that's still a simplification. And you know, what I like about this diagram is that, you know, people say, well, the facts are the facts, and what we're disagreeing about is our opinion about the facts. It's like, no. Yes, you have an opinion about the facts, but the world is so horribly complex that you can actually disagree about the facts themselves. And I think an ideology does that to people very, very commonly. So I saw this movie once that Naomi Klein made. If I tell you the same story, tell me, okay? Because I don't want to tell you the same story, but I might. So she went down to Argentina after a bunch of money had got out of Argentina because of a financial collapse, and she went to a factory that had been padlocked, and it was a heavy machinery factory, and the workers had decided they were going to undo the padlocks and go build machines, you know, to hell with the owner who shut it down. And so she went down and made this movie and followed these workers around and, you know, showed how catastrophic their lives had been because they'd lost their livelihood in this big financial crash. And so that was really interesting. But then she went and interviewed the guy who owned the factory, and she treated him like he was like a cipher in some sense. Instead of asking him how he got the factory, what he wanted to do with it, how it fit in with his life plans, why he shut it down instead of continuing it, you know, she didn't get the backstory on him. She just left him in the evil capitalist box and went on with the film. And it was like, it wasn't like what she did wasn't true. But it was only half true, and it was half true because she could perceive the complexity of the workers, having sympathy for them, but as far as she was concerned, the enemy, the owner, had no complexity. He was just bad capitalist, and that's how it was left in the movie. I found it profoundly unsatisfying because I wanted to know, okay, it's like, you know that these workers are suffering. It's not self-evident that you want your damn factory closed. You'd think you'd want it open so you could be building things. It's like, who are you? What are you doing? Why is this justifiable? Have a question about it. Well, you can take this infinite set of facts and then you subject it to your filters and you let some of the facts through and they're facts. But what about all the facts that you don't let through? That's the thing. And that's what the gorilla video shows too. It's like, yeah, you got the basketball count right, but you missed the big primate. And you might say, well, your priorities were a bit skewed in that circumstance because you were rearranging the deck chairs as the Titanic sank, you know, as the old joke goes. And so it's very much useful to think always, well, it isn't just your damn opinion that's biased, although it is. It's your perceptions that are biased. So, well, and with your words it's even more. So you say, well, you can't see the thing in itself because it's too complex, so you perceive it simpler than it is. And some of that perceptual simplification is dependent on your aims. So that's a vicious one because it pulls the value structure that you're ensconced within into your perceptions. It pulls it into the realm of facts itself. And then you do another, I think about this as a compression. You know, you can compress a photograph by getting rid of redundant information. That's sort of what you're doing here. So you're like one of these squares, little black squares here, black rectangles, compresses all of those. It's like we're going to treat those as if they're grayish black. Same thing happens here. So we're blurring across them. So we have a much less high resolution image here. So you take the thing in itself, you perceive it as a low resolution representation, and then you take that low resolution representation and you replace that with a word, and so the word is a twofold compression. And then when someone tosses you the word, you unpack it into the low resolution perception and then maybe into the world itself if you can do that, but probably not. So that's what we're doing. We're taking the complex world, we fold it into a simple perception, we fold that into a word, we throw the word to someone else and they unpack it. And the only way you can unpack it, of course, is if you've had enough similar experience so that you have the reference for the word already in your experience. So, which is why you have to use simplified language with children, right? Because there's no point tossing a child a concept that he or she can't unpack. So we compress a very complex reality through a very, very small keyhole. That's basically our cognitive processing. Okay, so then here's the next kind of argument. This goes along with the science religion argument that I was making earlier, which I want to unpack a little bit more. I think that fundamentalists and atheistic scientists have the same problem. The fundamentalists, so we could say the Christian fundamentalists in the US, make the proposition that biblical stories, we'll call them mythological stories, are literal representations of the truth. And that might be true depending on what you mean by literal. But what they mean by literal, or what they attempt to make literal mean, is that they're in the same category as scientific facts. Because they don't have the idea that there are different ways of approaching truth, and that truths can serve different purposes. They don't have a sense that your definition of truth is actually something like a tool rather than an ontological statement about the reality of the world. And so the fundamentalists basically make the proposition that the idea that God created the world in 6 days 5,000 years ago is literally true. And they get the 5,000 year estimate, by the way, by going through the genealogies in the Old Testament and adding up the hypothetical ages and figuring out, you know, how long before Moses Adam lived. And some bishop did that back in I think it was in the mid-1800s. I might be wrong about that, but it was somewhere back about that time. And more or less that's been accepted as canonical fact ever since. And then the scientists say, well, yeah, those are empirical truths, they're just wrong. See, and that's the only difference there is between the fundamentalists and the atheist scientists. The fundamentalists say those are fundamental scientific truths, and they're right, and the scientists say, well, they're scientific truths, they just happen to be wrong. Well, I think that's a stupid argument, personally. I mean, for a bunch of reasons. One is that the people who wrote the ancient stories that we have access to were in no way, shape, or form scientists. You know, modern people tend to think that you think like a scientist, and people have always thought that way. First of all, you do not think like a scientist. Even scientists hardly even think like scientists. But if you're not scientifically trained, you don't think like a scientist at all. So one of the things, for example, that characterizes your thinking is confirmation bias. And so if you have a theory, what you do is wander around in the world looking for reasons why it's true. And a scientist does exactly the opposite of that in the little tiny narrow domain where he or she is actually capable of being a scientist. And what they have is a theory and look for a way to prove it wrong. But believe me, you don't run around doing that. I mean, you can train yourself, so now and then you can do that. You know, you can learn to listen to people, for example, on the off chance that you might be wrong. But that is by no means a natural way of thinking. And of course, the fundamental philosophical axioms of the scientific method weren't developed until Descartes and Bacon and who else? Descartes, Bacon. There's one more. Anyways, the name escapes me at the moment. But you can argue about when science emerged, but it certainly emerged in its articulated form within the last 1,000 years. I think you could say even more specifically that it emerged in the last 500 years. Now you might argue with that and say, well, what about the Greeks and other people who were fairly technologically sophisticated or who invented geometry or that kind of thing? But yeah, bare precursors to the idea of empirical observation. Aristotle, for example, when he was writing down his knowledge of the world, it never occurred to him to actually go out in the world and look at it to see if what he assumed about it was true. And it certainly never occurred to Aristotle to get 20 people to go look at the same thing independently, write down exactly how they went about doing it, compare the records, and then extract out what was common. I mean, that seems self-evident to us to some degree, but you know, it was by no means self-evident to anyone 500 years ago, and people still don't do it. So it's not plausible. If you know anything about the history of ideas, it's not plausible to posit that stories about the nature of reality that existed before 500 years ago were scientific in any but the most cursory of ways. So why we have that argument continually is somewhat beyond me. Part of the reason is, though, that everyone, fundamentalists included, really believe in scientific facts. Even though they hate it, they'll use computers, they'll fly. Computers wouldn't work unless quantum mechanics were correct. Like, the fact that you use a high-tech device indicates through your action that you actually accept the theories upon which it's predicated, right? The same as flying, same as anything you do in a complex technological society. You're stuck with it. You're reading by the lights. Do they work? Yeah, they work. Well, so it's really hard for people who are trying to hold on to a way of looking at the world that appears to contradict the scientific claims when everything they do is predicated on their acceptance of the validity of the scientific claims. It's really problematic for people, and it's problematic in a real way, I think, because one of the problems with the scientific viewpoint is it doesn't tell you anything about what you should do with your life. It doesn't solve the problem of value at all. In fact, it might make it more difficult, because one of the fundamental scientific claims, roughly speaking, is that every fact is of equal utility, at least from a scientific perspective, right? There's no hierarchy of facts. It's not exactly true, because you can think of one theory as more true than another, but that boils down to saying that it's more useful than another. So I don't think that that's a really good exception. Okay, so fine. You got the scientific atheists on one end and you got the religious fundamentalists on the other, and what they both agree on, whether they like it or not, is that there's so much power in the scientific method that it's difficult to dispute the validity of scientific facts. And they seem to exist in contradiction to the older archaic stories if you also accept them as fact-based accounts. So what do we do about that? Well, if you're on the scientific atheist end of things, you say, well, those old stories are just superstitious science, second-rate, barbaric, archaic, forms of science, you just dispense with them, they're nothing but trouble. And if you're on the fundamentalist side, you say, well, we'll try to shoehorn science into this framework, and really that doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well with the claims of evolution, for example. In fact, it works very badly. And that's a problem, because evolutionary theory is like, it's a killer theory. And it's really, really hard. And like, it's not a complete theory, and there's lots of things we don't know about evolution, but, you know, trying to hand wave that away, that's not going to work without dispensing with most of biology. So that's a big problem. So here's another way of thinking about it. You don't just need one way of looking at the world. Maybe you need two ways of looking at the world, and I'm not exactly sure how they should be related to one another, like which should take precedence under which circumstance. But one problem is, what's the world made of? You know, what's the world conceptualized as an objective place made of? And the other is, how should you conduct yourself while you're alive? And there's no reason to assume that those questions can be answered using the same approach. I mean, physics has its methods, and chemistry has its methods, and biology has its methods. So a method for obtaining the truth can be bound to a domain. So why would we necessarily assume that you could use the same set of tools to represent the world as a place of objects and to represent it as a place in which a biological creature would act? I mean, anyways, I'm suggesting that we don't view it that way, that we have two different viewpoints. Maybe they can be brought together, although it's not obvious how, but that it's not a tenable solution to get rid of one in favor of the other. And I think the reason for that is that you need to know how to conduct yourself in the world. You have to have a value system. You can't even look at the damn world without a value system. It's not possible. Your emotional health is dependent on a value system. The way you interact with other people is dependent on a value system. There's no getting away from it. And you say, well, there's no justification for any value system from a scientific perspective. You're going to draw that conclusion that no value system is valid. Where the hell does that leave you? There's no down, there's no up, there's no rationale for moving in any direction. There's not even really any rationale for living. And so people say things like that. Well, why the hell should I care what happens in a million years? Who's going to know the difference? It's like, yeah, true. Stupid, but true. And the reason I think it's stupid is because it's just a game. You know, I can take anything of any sort and find a context in which it's irrelevant. It's just a rational game. It's like, who cares if 100 children freeze to death in a blizzard? What difference is it going to make a billion years? Well, what do you say to someone who says that? You say, well, seems like the wrong frame of reference, bucko. That's what it looks like to me. You know, because at some point you question the damn frame of reference, not what you derive from it. And it certainly seems to me that situations like that don't allow you to use that kind of frame of reference. There's something inhumane about it. And that trumps the logic, or at least it should. And if it doesn't, then all hell breaks loose, and that doesn't seem to be a good thing. Okay, so I have this quote from Shakespeare here. He says, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Well, it's the sort of thing that you'd expect a dramatist to pen, but that's how he looked at the world. And we still watch Shakespeare's plays some hundreds of years later, because there seems to be something essential captured in them. Something about how people do act, but more importantly, I think, how people should and shouldn't act. Because what fun is it going to a play that doesn't outline how someone should and how someone shouldn't act? You want a good guy, or a couple of them. Maybe they can be complex interminglings of good and bad, you know, that makes it more sophisticated. And you want a bad guy, or a bad, you know, you always want to see that contrasted, either within a character or between characters. And it's because you want to know how to live properly, that's how to be a good person, and you want to know how to live improperly, how to be a bad person, so you can watch out for people like that, or so you can figure out what that means for yourself. It's compelling, and that's another thing that's worth thinking about. Why is it compelling? And it's compelling to everyone. That's the thing that's so cool, is that there aren't that many phenomena that you can point to that are compelling to everyone. Music is close. It's a very rare person who doesn't like at least some genre of music, no matter how narrow. But the other one is stories. You're hard pressed to find someone, especially if they're younger, who doesn't like stories. Why? Is it a waste of time? Or is there something going on? Well, I think it's not only not a waste of time, it's actually the most fundamentally important thing you can possibly do, because there's no difference between understanding stories and figuring out how to get along in the world. So, and there's a tight relationship between the story that you inhabit that structures your behavior and the games that Piaget talked about that organize people's behavior. You know, to some degree, the reason that we can all sit in this room together like this is because a huge chunk of the value system that guides our behavior is shared. So I'm lecturing and you're sitting in the classroom, and that distinguishes us to some degree, but you know that that's partly merely a consequence of the difference in our age. It's the same trajectory, we just happen to occupy different positions in a value hierarchy that we both accept. And so as long as you feel that that's fair and just, then you're not going to object to it. But I'm here in the classroom for many of the same reasons that you're here in the classroom. If you look at the higher order parts of the value structure, and maybe right out at the end of that, because I've tried to figure out, if you push why you're doing what you're doing right now to its ultimate limit, so you can't get a story that's superordinate to that, it's something like, well, you believe that the investigation of the world to acquire knowledge is worthwhile. Otherwise, what the hell are you here for? And even if, you know, 80% of your motivation is to get a good, stable job, fair enough, there's still something outside of that, because the whole culture says, well, you're more likely to be able to function properly in a good, stable job if you're the sort of person who knows how to go out in the world and forage for information usefully. And I think that's very much analogous to the hero story. It's like you go out and you search the unknown to find something of value. And so fundamentally that's what we're doing in the classroom. And the reason we can all organize our behavior is because we accept that framework consciously. Consciously would be we know how to articulate it. Unconsciously it's, well, it doesn't matter, we know how to act out the patterns. Whether we know can say the rules or not, doesn't matter. Same as a wolf pack. We know the procedures, and you could describe them with an articulated value structure. Let's take a break. Okay, so let's go back to the complexity problem. See, I actually think it's in some sense, it's the fundamental problem. When you read about the terror management theorist types, they think that death is the fundamental problem. And that's a good argument, because it's definitely a fundamental problem, but I think it's a subset of the complexity problem. And the reason I think that is because sometimes people's lives become so complex that they'd rather be dead. So, and the reason they seek death through suicide is to make the complexity go away, because complexity causes suffering if it's uncontrolled. You know, things just get beyond your control. And that can happen, you know, if you're hit by 3 or 4 catastrophes at the same time. You know, maybe you have, the political system collapses, there's hyperinflation, you lose your job, and you have someone that you love or 2 people die, and maybe you get cancer, something like that. Like that, those things happen to people, and they just think, well, there's no getting out of this, like it's just too much. And you know, one of the things that's very interesting about being a psychologist is that what you learn if you're going to be a psychologist is that people come to you with mental illnesses, and that's almost never true. People come to you because their lives are so damn complicated they cannot stay on top of them in any way that doesn't make it look like they're just going to get more complicated. And so then that causes symptoms. You know, it's like, there's this old idea, it's sort of a metaphor for genetic susceptibility. Take a balloon and blow it up until it's beyond its tolerance, it's going to blow out at the weakest point. Well, that's sort of what a genetic susceptibility is. If I just keep adding complexity on top of you, at some point you'll blow out at your weakest point. You know, maybe you'll get physiologically ill, maybe you'll start drinking, maybe you'll develop an anxiety disorder, maybe you'll get OCD, maybe you'll get depressed, whatever. There'll be something about you that's the weakest point, and if I just push, that's where you'll blow out. So that's a mental illness, but those things almost never just happen. Sometimes, but not very often. Usually people have just been hammered like 2 or 3 different ways, and then they collapse in the direction of their biological weakness, and then maybe you put them back together, but it's almost always a complexity related phenomena rather than a mental illness related phenomena. Not always, but almost always. So, okay, so now you got this complexity problem, and you think, well, you deal with it conceptually, and that's sort of akin to the idea that it's belief systems that protect you from death anxiety. The ideas are roughly comparable, but again, that's wrong. It's the sort of thing only a psychologist could think up, because psychologists think that everything about you happens inside your head, so to speak, in your psyche, but that's not true. There's a huge chunk of you that's outside of you completely. And so this is a really good example. Like, you know, we know the oldest cities. This is a medieval city in France, a beautiful old city. Old cities were walled, and the reason for that was because they were places of wealth, and if you didn't put walls around them, then other people would come in and steal everything and kill you. So like having some walls was a good idea, like the same as having walls in your house is a good idea. Walls between your rooms are a good idea, or borders between categories are a good idea. And so part of the way you simplify the world is by building walls around your space, because then a whole bunch of things can't come in, and so you don't even have to think about them. It's not conceptual, it's practical. And so, and you know, one of the things I think I figured out recently is the fundamental political difference between people. And it looks to me like the fundamental political difference is how many walls should there be around your stuff? And the ultimate liberal answer is 0. And the ultimate conservative answer is, well, bring on those walls, man. And what's interesting about both those perspectives, first of all, is that there's temperamental contributions to them, and second, that they're both valid. So one of the mysteries, I believe, that permeates psychometric psychology right now is why the temperamental factors that influence politics are those particular temperamental factors. So there's 5, let's say, right? This classic big 5: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. Well, the biggest predictors of political allegiance, forget about the politically correct types for a minute, but on the liberal to conservative axis is that the liberals are low in conscientiousness and high in openness, and the conservatives are high in conscientiousness and low in openness. And so then you think, well, why those 2 traits? That's the first question. And the second question is, why those 2 traits together, given that they're not very highly correlated?